Hey there, guys. I know as well as you do what is actually popular on this project, especially on the blog. Every time I post anything about National Pastime, it gets all sorts of views. It gets all sorts of people interested. People talk about it in places and so on and so forth. I'm aware of it. I haven't posted about it much recently. I've been a little bit busy with life, but I have had the opportunity to go through and to take a look at a couple of things that I think you might find interesting. One of the things that really strikes me about National Pastime, the old Clifford Van Beek game, is that the truth is that Van Beek didn't really have to do the things that he did, right? If you think about it, the easiest way to create a baseball game is kind of through the Strat-O-Matic method, which is where you take a player's real-life performance and you simply divide it up onto a player's card. I think that's probably the generally commonly accepted way of creating a game. It's probably the first thing that comes to mind when you think about how to create a game. Now, there are all sorts of permeations and other things to take into consideration, like batter-handedness and different modifications to put onto pitchers to prevent them from doing certain things they didn't do in real life, and so on and so forth. Different games have different answers to this, but the basic idea is that you have a card for a batter, a card for a pitcher, and half the results are on one, half are on the other. And, no matter what the situation is, the rule for the player is the rule for the player. Clifford Van Beek didn't do that. Instead, he created a complicated game. For the first of its kind, it was very complicated, in which there were boards divided up by plate or by base runner scenarios, and there were play result numbers on each of these boards for different results. Those numbers were then matrixed onto cards, which had 36 dice rolls each, 11 through 16, 21 through 26, and so on through 66. And created kind of a completely different approach to it. It's really only sort of Clifford Van Beek and the people whose games followed in his wake, APBA and then the other APBA derivatives mostly, who use this particular type of system. It's unique in that different board scenarios are treated differently, right? It's, in other words, depending upon the play result number, something that is, say, a double with the bases empty could be a home run with a runner on first base, could be a triple with runners on first and second, and so on. This requires knowledge of something that I'm not sure that Van Beek actually had. It requires knowledge of what those real-life at-bats, or we could even say plate appearances, scenario numbers were like. You have to be able to know how frequently something turns up to know how to make the cards and how to weigh one result against another. Now, we don't have a lot of evidence that Clifford Van Beek had like actual numbers, but he had an understanding of this. There's a lot of evidence for that. And we can take a look at that here. So what I've done is I have gone through Baseball Reference, which has this information on real-life plate appearance and batting and at-bat scenarios broken down by the 8 different on-base situations. I didn't look at whether there were any outs or anything like that. I didn't look at batting average or a slugging percentage or any of that stuff. All we're looking at is just the number of at-bats to see what the breakdown is. It goes back in both the National and American Leagues to 1914. However, the early data is incomplete because we don't have full play-by-play data. In fact, as part of this really complex spreadsheet, I have calculated the percentage of plate appearances and of at-bats that we have for each season. For the National League, we're almost complete, right? The lowest we have really is 1919. We have 70% of plate appearances and 71% of at-bats accounted for, i.e. where it was. Most of it, once you get down a little bit, is at 100%. American League looks a little bit worse, right? 1918 here, 1919 again, sorry, has 43.73% of at-bats, 43.93% or of plate appearances, 43.93% of at-bats accounted for. But still, it's a pretty good sample, right? We have a pretty good idea of how this was broken down over time. And what you will notice here when we look at both plate appearances, but especially at at-bats, is that things are very, very constant over baseball history, right? You have between about 50, say, just looking at this, 50 to 55% or so of plate appearances are with the bases empty. Runners on first, well, there's a runner on first maybe between 17 and 20% of the time. Runner on second between 8, maybe high 7s, and 9% of the time, and so on and so forth. For at-bats, it's almost exactly the same breakdown. Now, when you look at this over the course of baseball history and you scroll down here to the bottom, what we can see is what the average was, what the median was, what the min and max were, and then what the standard deviation is. You can see how constant this is over the history of baseball, right? So when we look only at plate appearances, about 54% of plate appearances in any given season, 54 to 55% will be with the bases empty. The median is right at 55%. The lowest ever was 49%, which I believe goes to the 1968 American League, if I remember right. Sorry for scrolling through quickly. No, that's the highest percent. So the lowest percent is 49.11. Lowest percent, I think, was in the 30s. Yeah, 1936 American League. And then the highest percentage was that 1968 American League. Makes sense, right? You would assume that 1936, when hitting was down and guys weren't getting on base, you'd have a lot of plate appearances with nobody on base, right? At-bats are very, very similar, maybe a little bit higher. Both the standard deviation for plate appearances and at-bats are very, very close. The max for at-bats a little bit higher, 59%, as opposed to this 57% of plate appearances. I believe that is because of the impact that walks have, which are not counted, of course, in plate appearances. This really, though, is kind of going out with the wash. If you think about what Clifford Van Beek was probably looking at, we're guessing he probably thought it was about 55% with this scenario. Runners on at first, it's about 20%, maybe a little bit less, again, without too much variance, but with some variance. And then once you get past that, that's when your variance really disappears, right? Runners on at second, it's always going to be right around 8%. Very, very low variance for either one of these. The runner on at third, you'll get, probably about 3%. Again, the variance starts to decrease as you go forward. Runners on first and second happen maybe about 7% of the time. Runners on at second or first and third, 3% of the time. Second and third, of course, is rare, 2%, sometimes less. For at-bats, it's actually much less. And the reason why is because with the runners on second and third, chances are you're going to walk the batter. And with the bases loaded, we're getting maybe 2.5% of the time, or maybe a little bit less. The thing that's amazing to me is that this holds so constant throughout the history of baseball, no matter what offenses do, no matter what defenses do, right? We were just looking at what the 1936 American League, right? And we're like, wow, this is low. Yeah, for hitting heavy eras like this, it's low. But is it extremely low? Not really. When we look at other hitting heavy eras, such as the 90s, it looks a little bit higher, 53, 54, 55%. In fact, in what we would consider to be a hitting era very recently, it was still up to 56, 57% of plate appearances were with nobody on base. And if you look in the National League, which is where the hitting really happened, again, it's actually a little bit higher than in the American League. Interesting stuff. Most of the variance, I can tell you, just by looking at this, comes between having nobody on base and having that runner on at first, right? That's really what's going on, and that's going to, I believe at least, fluctuate back and forth depending sort of on the overall level of offense. The rest of this stuff over here hardly ever changes. I mean, it changes so little that you can almost set your watch to it, right? Year after year, it's going to be more or less the same thing. Now, there's a chance, because I did a lot of this by hand, that I might have mistranscribed something, and you can let me know if you run into that, because I do have this up on the members section of the blog. So you can go over there and check it out and let me know what I've done right and what I've done wrong. But at least for me, this is absolutely fascinating stuff, and not only because it shows that what Clifford Van Beek did was certainly possible, but also because it shows that baseball as we know it hasn't really changed that much over time. We're talking about differences in like overall batting averages or differences in how many runs are scored and stuff like that. The real core, the real heart of the game, guys getting on base and stuff like that is pretty much the same today as it's always been in the past. That's the thing about this, is just so interesting to me, right? It seems to be just about the same. It seems to have remained constant over time. And that's the thing that allows games like APBA or National Pastime Next Generation or NPIII or whatever else to continue to exist and to continue to be competitive and to continue to be able to create a realistic product. Because even though the boards are kind of set in stone, I mean, they change them a little bit, but the boards are mostly set in stone, the overall concept here applies and works regardless of which era you use. In fact, I would go as far as to say that the thing that will show you that it's the sport of baseball is that about 55% of plate appearances are with bases empty, 19% or so with a runner on first, and so on and so forth. That's kind of what the definition of the sport is. So there you go. I'd love to know what your thoughts are on this subject. A little bit geeky, a little bit out there, but I consider it to be fascinating. Talk to you later. Bye.